Hi, hey, hello. I fell into a rabbit hole of watching every video on YouTube on Dahmer, the last Netflix series that came out. Within its first week of release, it beat all the other shows in viewership. Everybody's been talking about it. But there's been a lot of controversy around it. Mostly, people have found it to be rather accurate compared to other shows. The acting of Evan Peters was on point, and the ambiance of the show was quite dark and disturbing. It was uncomfortable to watch. It was kind of the point. So, although there were some discrepancies, that's not what caused all the controversy. Netflix didn't consult the families of the victim before casting actors in their role to act out their heartfelt, real testimonies for the series. They didn't ask, they didn't reach out, yet they claim to have made the show with the families in mind. And it's possible that they did by putting in an episode centered around one of the victims, as well as putting in the victims' families and their testimonies precisely. They might have thought they were bringing them into the spotlight and in a way kind of honoring them, and they did a good job with the accuracy of the speeches and everything, minus the family that was not actually there that they placed in court on the show. But had they discussed it with the families, they would have been told that it would be too painful and that it would feel like they were reliving the whole ordeal again, in which case they could have left certain parts out at the very least, or worked with the families to turn it into something that they could tolerate. Of course, the former prosecutor complained about how the show made the police look racist and homophobe. I mean, you can hear them yourselves on the dispatcher, making fun of the, quote, homosexual intoxicated Asian man and his sober boyfriend, end quote, and them now having to get, quote, deloused at the station, end quote. Plus, given everything that happened recently with the police that sparked the BLM movement, need I say more? I don't think so. It's in fact one of the main focal points in this case that homophobia and racism both played a part in Jeffrey Dahmer being able to keep this up for so long. So the show had an LGBTQ tag, and Netflix dropped the tag following the backlash from the LGBTQ community who didn't want to be associated with him and his actions, which on one hand is understandable, and on the other, in this case, it just signified that he was gay and so were his victims, and it can be argued that it helped bring awareness to another example of how this community has been victimized along with minorities. Now, I did learn 3 things that I personally did not know prior to watching all of those videos. Number 1, in that period of 9 years in between his first and second kill, he was in fact still acting on these urges and obsessions of his with the completely submissive other, aka the dead. He would find young men that had recently passed away in obituaries and go to their funerals. And then later on, he would dig the bodies out and play out his fantasies. That is at least what his mother revealed in an interview. Number 2, his father, in his book called A Father's Story, I believe, he talks about how he himself had thoughts of committing murders, etc. So they each had their dark secrets, but one of them took them to the next level. And that makes me wonder if there's a genetic component to these things. I don't know, maybe. And the third thing that I discovered was that Christopher Scarver, the guy who ended up killing Jeffrey, he had said to justify his actions that he had heard voices telling him to do this. At some point I heard he thought it was God, then the families. He later admitted that Jeffrey and the other guy who also got attacked were antagonizing him, as well as other inmates. Jeffrey was supposedly telling people he would bite them, molding his food into shapes of limbs, using ketchup to represent blood, and leaving it out so they would find it. In other words, he was making distasteful jokes about cannibalism, no pun intended. He added that some inmates were repentant, but that he was not one of them, which goes against what I had previously been led to believe, with him having found God, having been baptized, and through what he would say in his interviews. But come to think of it, he did tell his mother he didn't want to be in jail anymore, and he knew he was never going to be let out, so he might have done all this to get himself killed. Who knows? We may never know. He told his mother his life was pathetic, and it was better if it ended. That kind of stung. But it doesn't excuse anything, of course. I mean, come on, the depth of the horrors that he allowed himself to go to, just insane. As for my thoughts on the series and Netflix making it in itself, well, it's a very gray area, and if you've seen my The Most Overrated Serial Killers video, you have a general idea of my stance on the topic of covering the same serial killers over and over and over, and of the effect that it can have on the people. I'll link it at the end of the video in case you haven't seen it. It can totally vary depending on each case, but most of the time, when there are survivors or families and loved ones of victims that are still around and can be exposed to these movies or series or documentaries, especially those that are of this scale and which are going to be extremely difficult for them to ignore, there needs to be communication with them beforehand and maybe even during production. I understand that they have no legal obligation to ask for anybody's permission, but there is such a thing as moral obligation when the level of emotional distress that can be caused as a result of this is so big. They might have had the best of intentions, thinking that by making an episode focused on one of the victims and by having the families featured, well, actors who portray them, they were putting them in the spotlight and that this was a good thing. All the while, the families might have preferred to just not be featured in this way, or the trial part to have been suggested, not shown, because they were there and it was too much realism for them. But for Netflix to have known, they would have had to ask. Maybe they didn't want the creative direction to be driven by the families, in which case they cannot claim that they made this for the victims and the families. Well, there's another way that they could make this claim. If they were to give them a percentage of the earnings, then they could literally claim that they did it with them in mind. The idea of making money off of telling a true story, no matter how tragic it is, if it's done right, I don't personally see that it is inherently wrong, but it can induce pain still. As for being handed money from the fact that a tragic story involving a loved one is being told, it could also have its downsides and caveats. So yeah, it's a complicated issue, and communication, I'd say, would have been a good place to start. So to the question, did we need another series on Dahmer? I'd say without hesitation that no, we didn't. There's been about 20 out there already. Just movies, documentaries, and series, not even counting YouTube videos or books. I think it's about time to give it a rest and let the families grieve in peace. But guess what? There's the Dahmer Tapes Netflix documentary coming out soon. So there's that. I'm going to link the video on the most overrated serial killers. You can watch it right here. And if you found the video interesting, subscribe, like, share it with your friends. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.